"Uncle, could you please stand next to me when they call my name?" Daniel Wright stopped, not slowly, not thoughtfully. He simply froze, as if the sentence had reached him before his mind could prepare a defense. His fingers tightened around the edge of the program booklet. The paper bent slightly, making a soft, dry sound he noticed only because everything else seemed to fall quiet inside his head. He blinked. Once. Then again. For a moment. He was certain he must have misunderstood. No one ever spoke to him that way. Uncle was not a word that belonged to his world of boardrooms and contracts and carefully rehearsed speeches. He lowered his gaze. The girl stood in front of him, small and uncertain, her body angled as though she might retreat at any second. Her eyes were red around the edges, glossy in the way that suggested she had been holding something back for a long time. She clutched the fabric of her pale blue dress with one hand, twisting it nervously. Her name badge read, Annie Johnson. Daniel felt his breath catch. I'm sorry, he said quietly, his voice lower than usual. Were you talking to me? Annie nodded, but she didn't look up right away. When she finally did, her eyes met his only briefly before darting away again, like a bird unsure whether the space was safe. Yes, sir, she whispered. I mean, Uncle, I'm sorry. My mom says I should call grown-ups sir. She hesitated, her lower lip trembling. But, could you, just for a little bit? The noise of the auditorium pressed in around them, laughter, applause, the low hum of conversation, but Daniel felt oddly removed from it, as if the world had narrowed to the space between him and this child. He didn't answer right away. Annie's eyes filled further, and she rushed to explain, the words tumbling over one another. I won't talk or anything, she said quickly. You don't have to say my name. You don't even have to smile. I just don't want to walk up there alone. Something in her voice, thin, strained, far too careful, made Daniel's chest tighten. He swallowed. Where are your parents? He asked, gently. After a few seconds, the question landed harder than he intended. Annie's shoulders sagged, as if she had been expecting it. She stared down at her shoes, at the faint scuff marks along the toes. My dad's not here, she said softly. It's just me and my mom. Daniel nodded, slowly. And your mom? He prompted. For a moment, Annie didn't speak. Her eyes grew glassy, and she blinked hard, the way children do when they're determined not to cry in front of strangers. She wanted to come, Annie said at last. She picked my dress last night. She ironed it. Even though it was really late, Daniel said nothing. He felt that if he did, he might interrupt something important. But she couldn't, Annie continued. Her voice wavered now. If she leaves work, they'll fire her. She cleans offices downtown. Her boss said no time off this week. Not even for today. She paused, then added in a smaller voice. She told me to be brave. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief second. When he opened them again, he looked at Annie properly this time, not just as a child in front of him, but as a child standing alone in a room built for families. He glanced past her, through the curtain, toward the auditorium. The scene was painfully ordinary. Parents filled the rows, leaning toward their children, phones raised, arms draped protectively around small shoulders. A father laughed loudly somewhere near the front. A mother wiped tears from her eyes, already emotional before the ceremony had truly begun. And then there was Annie. One small figure, set apart by nothing more than absence. The host's voice rang out from the stage. Parents and guardians, please be ready to join your child when their name is called. Annie flinched. Daniel saw it. That's why you asked me, he said quietly. Because they want someone to stand with you. Annie nodded. A tear escaped despite her efforts, sliding down her cheek. She wiped it away quickly with the back of her hand, embarrassed. I know you're busy, she said. You look important. I heard the teachers say you paid for this whole thing. I just thought maybe, since you're already here, she trailed off, the sentence unfinished, the hope fragile. Daniel felt a familiar instinct rise in him, the instinct to step back, to draw a line, to keep things clean and uncomplicated. He knew exactly how this could look. He knew how easily kindness could be questioned, twisted, turned into something ugly by people who preferred suspicion to empathy. He should have said no. Instead, A memory surfaced without warning. A different auditorium, smaller, older, folding chairs on a polished gym floor. He was 10 years old, holding a certificate, while his name echoed through the room. He remembered scanning the crowd, heart pounding, knowing even then that no one was coming. He remembered the applause feeling loud and hollow at the same time. Be brave, he had been told too. Daniel exhaled slowly. He crouched down in front of Annie so they were eye level. Her lashes were wet, her face tense with the effort of holding herself together. I can stand with you, he said. Annie stared at him, stunned. You can? Yes, he replied, surprising himself with how steady his voice sounded. I can. For a moment, she didn't move, as if she were afraid the answer might disappear if she acknowledged it too quickly. Then, her shoulders relaxed. Just a fraction, and she let out a shaky breath. Thank you, she whispered. The host's voice rose again, bright and clear. Our first honoree today is Annie Johnson. Applause rippled through the auditorium. Daniel straightened and extended his hand, not pulling, not leading, simply offering it. Annie took it. Her grip, small but firm. Together, they stepped onto the stage. The reaction was immediate. Conversations stalled. Heads turned. Phones lifted higher. Daniel felt the familiar heat of attention settle over him. But for once, it didn't matter. Annie walked beside him, her steps cautious but determined. When they reached the center of the stage, she stopped. Daniel stood next to her, close enough that she wasn't alone. Annie glanced up at him once, just to make sure. He was still there. She faced the audience and stood a little taller. As the applause swelled, Daniel felt his eyes burn. He blinked rapidly, but it was too late. A tear slipped free, tracing a slow path down his cheek. He didn't wipe it away. Because in that moment, standing beside a child who had been brave long before she should have had to be, he understood something he had missed for years. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do is not speak. Sometimes it's simply not walking away. The applause lingered longer than Annie expected. At first, it washed over her in a warm, confusing wave, louder than anything she had ever heard directed at her before. Her ears rang slightly. She could feel the vibration of it through the thin soles of her shoes, up through her legs, into her chest. For a moment, she wondered if the clapping was meant for someone else. Someone taller. Someone who belonged more naturally on a stage like this. She kept her eyes forward, just like her teacher had told her to do when she practiced in front of the mirror at home. Daniel stood beside her, close enough that she could sense him without turning her head. His presence was steady, quiet, like a wall that didn't move even when the room seemed to tilt. She hadn't realized how tense her shoulders were until they slowly began to relax. The woman holding the microphone smiled at Annie. You must be very proud, she said, glancing briefly at Daniel, then back at the girl. It's not every day we honor someone so young for such determination. Annie nodded, unsure what to do with the word proud. It felt too big, too slippery. She tightened her fingers around the edge of the small certificate that had just been placed in her hands. Daniel noticed. He leaned down slightly, just enough that only she could hear him. You're doing great, he murmured. Take your time. She nodded again, grateful for the permission. From the audience, Annie could see faces now, rows of them. Some were smiling, some looked curious. A few looked confused. She spotted a woman in the second row wiping her eyes with a tissue, and that surprised her. Annie had never seen a grown-up cry because of something she did. The applause faded into a softer, scattered clapping as the host continued. Annie was selected by her teachers for her perseverance, her kindness to classmates, and her remarkable effort in the face of challenges many adults would struggle with. Annie's stomach fluttered. Challenges. That was the word the teachers liked to use. It sounded nicer than tired or worried or scared. The host gestured toward Annie. Would you like to say a few words? Annie froze. She hadn't known she was going to have to talk. Her heart began to race, and instinctively, her hand tightened around Daniel's sleeve. She didn't even realize she had done it until she felt the solid reassurance of fabric beneath her fingers. Daniel felt it. He didn't pull away. Instead, he placed his hand gently over hers, not gripping, just covering it. The simple gesture steadied her more than any instruction ever could. "You don't have to," he whispered. "Only if you want to." Annie swallowed. The microphone looked enormous up close, like it could swallow her whole. She thought of her mom that morning, standing in the tiny kitchen, tying her hair back before work, telling her, "Be brave, baby. I'll be thinking about you." She nodded. The microphone was lowered to her height. Annie leaned forward slightly, her voice small at first but clear. "My name is Annie Johnson," she said. The sound of her own voice echoed faintly through the speakers, and she almost jumped. I worked really hard this year." A soft chuckle rippled through the audience, not mocking, but affectionate. Annie took a breath. "My mom says working hard matters even when no one is watching," she continued. "She couldn't be here today because she had to work, but she told me to tell everyone thank you." There was a pause, a heavier one this time. Daniel felt it too. Annie glanced up at him briefly, then back at the audience. "I was scared to come up here by myself," she added honestly, "but I wasn't alone." She didn't point. She didn't have to. Daniel felt something twist sharply in his chest. If this moment touched you, take a second to like this video. Tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what this story made you feel. And if you believe quiet courage still matters, subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. The applause returned, louder this time, more unified. Annie flinched again, but this time she smiled just a little, the corners of her mouth lifting as if surprised by her own courage. When they stepped off the stage, the noise followed them, then slowly receded behind the curtain. The lighting changed abruptly, the brightness giving way to the softer shadows backstage. Annie exhaled, a long breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "I did it," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "You did," Daniel agreed. "Every part of it." She looked up at him, studying his face with the seriousness children reserve for important moments. "You didn't leave," she said. "No," he replied simply. "I didn't." For a second, she looked like she might say more, but a volunteer approached, smiling a little too brightly. "Mr. Wright," the woman said, her eyes flicking between him and Annie. "That was unexpected, but very moving. We'll need you back at the front in a few minutes." Daniel nodded politely. "Of course." As the volunteer walked away, Annie shifted her weight again, suddenly uncertain. "I can go sit down now," she said quickly. "You don't have to stay with me." Daniel frowned slightly. "Where would you sit?" She gestured vaguely toward the rows of chairs. "Anywhere. I don't mind." He knew that wasn't true. "I'll walk you," he said. They moved slowly through the aisle. Conversations hushed as they passed. Annie felt eyes on her again, but this time, it felt different. Not sharp, not isolating. Curious, yes, but also warm. They reached an empty seat near the end of a row. Annie paused. "My mom usually sits by the aisle when she can come," she said softly. "She says it's easier on her legs." Daniel nodded. "Then we'll sit here." He sat down beside her without hesitation. Annie stared at him, surprised. "You don't have to," she said again. "I know," he replied. "I want to." Jacked. For a while, they sat in silence, listening as other children were called to the stage. Annie watched carefully, noticing things she hadn't before: the way some kids leaned into their parents, the way others scanned the crowd nervously before spotting a familiar face. She glanced sideways at Daniel. He was watching the stage, but his expression was distant, thoughtful. "Were you scared when you were little?" she asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. He hesitated, then answered honestly. "Yes," he said. "More often than I wanted people to know." She considered that. "Did someone stand with you?" Daniel shook his head. "No." Annie nodded slowly. "I'm glad you stood with me." "So am I," he said. The ceremony continued, but something had already shifted. Annie no longer felt like the smallest person in the room, and Daniel, sitting in a folding chair in a crowded auditorium, realized that the most important thing he had done all year hadn't required a check or a signature. It had required staying. The ceremony moved on, but Annie felt as though something important had already happened, something separate from the awards and speeches still unfolding on stage. She sat with her feet dangling just above the floor, gently swinging them back and forth, the certificate resting carefully in her lap. Every few minutes, she glanced down at it, half expecting it to disappear if she looked away too long. Daniel noticed. "It's real," he said quietly, following her gaze. "They don't take those back." Was. Annie smiled faintly. "My mom's going to put it on the wall," she said, "right next to the calendar. She says that's where important things go." "I think she's right," Daniel replied. On stage, another child was being introduced. Applause rose again, steady and polite. Daniel clapped along, but his attention kept drifting back to the girl beside him. Annie's posture had changed. She wasn't folded in on herself the way she'd been earlier. She leaned back in her chair now, shoulders resting against the plastic back, as if she finally believed she was allowed to take up the space. After a few minutes, a man in a dark blazer approached from the aisle. He wore the tense smile of someone who managed events for a living, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. "Mr. Wright," he said, in a low voice, careful not to draw attention. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Daniel nodded. "Of course. Annie's fingers tightened instinctively around the edge of her certificate. "I'll be right here," Daniel told her, his tone calm and certain. "I'm not going anywhere." She searched his face, then nodded. "Okay." Daniel stepped a few feet into the aisle with the man. They spoke quietly, but Annie caught fragments. Unexpected optics, social media, parents asking questions. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression neutral. "I understand," he said finally, "but I made a choice. I'm comfortable with it." The man hesitated. "We just want to make sure there are no misunderstandings." Daniel's voice remained steady. "Then perhaps the misunderstanding is thinking a child needs to explain why she doesn't want to stand alone." The man blinked, clearly unprepared for that answer. "Of course," he said after a moment. "We'll handle it." When Daniel returned to his seat, Annie looked up at him anxiously. "Did I do something wrong?" "No," he said immediately. "You didn't do anything wrong. Are they mad?" she asked. Daniel considered how to answer. "Some adults get uncomfortable when things don't go the way they planned," he said carefully. "That doesn't mean you did anything bad." Annie thought about that, then nodded slowly. "My mom says grown-ups don't always know what they're doing either." Daniel smiled. "Your mom sounds wise." "She is," Annie said with certainty. The ceremony finally came to an end. Chairs scraped against the floor as people stood, the noise swelling again as families gathered their things. Children ran toward waiting arms. Cameras flashed. Laughter and relief filled the air. Annie stayed seated for a moment, watching. "Do you want to go down now?" Daniel asked. She hesitated. "Can we wait a second?" "Of course." They sat as the crowd thinned. Annie scanned the room, her eyes lingering on the door. "She should be off in about an hour," Annie said quietly, as if thinking aloud. "Sometimes she comes straight home. Sometimes she has to clean another building." Daniel nodded. "Does she know you're done?" Annie shook her head. "I'll tell her when I get home. I want to tell her everything. I think she'll like that," he said. When they finally stood, Annie adjusted the strap of her small backpack. Daniel walked beside her toward the exit, their pace unhurried. Near the door, a woman approached them, perhaps in her early 50s, with kind eyes and a hesitant smile. "I just wanted to say," she began, addressing Daniel but looking at Annie. "That was a beautiful thing you did up there." Daniel inclined his head. "Thank you." She turned fully to Annie. "You were very brave," she said. "Your mother must be so proud." Annie smiled, this time without reservation. "She is," she said. "She just couldn't come." "Is." The woman nodded, understanding something unspoken, then moved on. Outside, the late afternoon light was softer, the air warmer than it had been that morning. Parents clustered on the steps, taking photos, exchanging congratulations. Annie paused at the top of the stairs. "This is where I go," she said. "My bus stops that way." Daniel followed her gaze. "Do you have to go right now?" She shrugged. "The bus comes in 10 minutes. He considered that. "Would you mind if I walked with you to the corner?" Annie's eyes widened slightly. "You can do that?" "If you'd like." She nodded, quick and eager. I'd like that. They walked side by side down the steps and along the sidewalk. Annie held her certificate carefully against her chest, as if it were fragile. "Uncle?" she asked after a moment. Daniel glanced at her. "Yes? You're not really my uncle, right?" "No," he said gently. "I'm not." She nodded, satisfied. "But you stood with me. With Havens as mine." "Yes," he said again. "That still counts," Annie decided. Daniel felt something warm settle in his chest, equal parts ache and gratitude. At the corner, the bus stop sign stood slightly crooked, plastered with old notices. Annie stopped and turned to face him. "Thank you," she said, her voice earnest. "For not leaving." "You're welcome," he replied. "And Annie?" "Yes, you never have to apologize for wanting someone with you." She smiled, small but certain. "Okay, The bus appeared in the distance. Annie climbed aboard, taking a seat by the window. As it pulled away, she pressed her certificate against the glass and waved. Daniel stood there until the bus disappeared around the corner. Only then did he realize how quiet it was. He exhaled slowly, aware that something had shifted inside him, something he wouldn't be able to undo even if he wanted to. He didn't want to. Daniel didn't go straight home. He stood at the bus stop long after Annie's bus had disappeared, his hands resting loosely in the pockets of his coat, staring at the empty stretch of road as if something might still emerge from it. Cars passed. A cyclist rode by. Somewhere nearby, a siren wailed and then faded. Life moved on, indifferent and efficient. He felt oddly unmoored. For most of his adult life, moments ended cleanly. Meetings adjourned. Contracts were signed. Decisions concluded. But this had no clear edge. There was no document to file. No assistant to brief. Just the echo of a small voice asking a question he hadn't known he needed to answer. "Could you stand next to me?" Daniel exhaled slowly and turned toward his car. The driver opened the door without speaking, reading the expression on Daniel's face with the quiet intuition that came from years of working together. "Home?" the driver asked after a moment. Daniel hesitated. "Not yet," he said. "Give me a few minutes." He slid into the back seat, but instead of reaching for his phone, he rested his head briefly against the leather and closed his eyes. The memory came uninvited. He was 10 again, standing in that gymnasium, the lights too bright, the applause too general to mean anything. He remembered walking off the stage alone, folding the certificate carefully so it wouldn't wrinkle, already planning where he would hide it when he got home. Achievements were safer when no one saw them. He opened his eyes. His phone buzzed almost immediately. A text from his assistant. The event went well. Social media already picking it up. Mostly positive. Daniel frowned slightly and typed back, "I didn't do it for that." 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. No response followed. He slipped the phone back into his pocket. Across town, Annie sat on the bus with her legs tucked up on the seat, watching familiar streets slide past the window. The bus smelled faintly of rubber and something sweet, maybe gum. She held her certificate carefully, smoothing the edges whenever the bus jolted. She replayed the day in her mind, not the applause or the lights, but the moment before the seconds when she had stood in the shadow of the curtain, certain she would have to step out alone. She thought about how it felt when Daniel had said yes. At her stop, she hopped down and walked the few blocks to her apartment building. A narrow brick structure squeezed between a laundromat and a small grocery store. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, heart pounding with a new kind of excitement. Her mom wouldn't be home yet, but Annie didn't mind. She wanted to rehearse what she would say. Inside the apartment, she placed the certificate carefully on the kitchen table, right where her mom would see it first. Then she sat down across from it, her chin in her hands, smiling to herself. Back in the car, Daniel finally gave the driver the address. The ride downtown felt longer than usual. He watched the city through the tinted window storefronts, pedestrians, construction sites wrapped in scaffolding. This was his city, one he had helped shape with steel and glass and carefully calculated investments. Yet somehow, he felt like a visitor in it. When he arrived home, the silence greeted him like an old acquaintance. The apartment was immaculate, every surface exactly where it should be. He set his keys down, removed his jacket, and loosened his tie, but the quiet pressed in more heavily than usual. He poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen counter, staring at nothing. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was an unknown number. He almost ignored it. Almost. "Hello?" he answered. There was a pause, then a woman's voice, cautious but firm. "Is this Mr. Wright?" "Yes," he said. "Who's calling?" "My name is Karen Johnson," the woman said. "I'm Annie's mother." Daniel straightened instinctively. "I hope I'm not bothering you," she continued quickly. "One of the teachers gave me your number. She said you stood with my daughter today." "Today, I did," Daniel said gently. There was a brief silence on the line. When Karen spoke again, her voice trembled despite her efforts to steady it. "I just got home," she said. "Annie told me everything." She wouldn't stop talking. She kept saying, "Mom, he didn't leave. He stayed." Daniel closed his eyes. "I wanted to thank you," Karen said. "I didn't know how much it meant to her until I saw her face tonight. I hated not being there. I still do." "You had to work," Daniel said. "That doesn't make you a bad mother." Karen let out a shaky breath. "Thank you for saying that," she said. "Most people don't." Another pause. "I was worried," she admitted, when she said a stranger stood with her. "But then she said you listened, and you didn't make her feel small." Daniel felt the weight of that settle on him. "She's not small," he said. "Not in any way that matters." Karen was quiet for a moment. "I don't know what tomorrow brings," she said finally, "but today mattered, and I won't forget that." "Neither will I," Daniel replied. After they hung up, Daniel remained standing at the counter, phone still in his hand. The apartment no longer felt quite as empty, but it no longer felt entirely safe either. Something had been invited in. Across the city, Annie lay on her bed, the certificate now taped carefully to the wall beside the calendar. Just like she'd said, her mom sat on the edge of the mattress, brushing Annie's hair with slow, gentle strokes. "You were very brave today," Karen said softly. Annie smiled, sleepy and satisfied. "I wasn't by myself," she said. Karen kissed her forehead. "No," she agreed. "You weren't." As Annie drifted toward sleep, one thought lingered, warm and steady. Sometimes, people stayed, and sometimes, that changed everything. The next morning arrived quietly. Daniel woke before his alarm, the pale gray light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his apartment. For a moment, he lay still, disoriented, his mind suspended between sleep and memory. Then the image returned, Annie standing beside him on the stage, her small hand gripping his sleeve with surprising strength. He sat up. For years, mornings had followed a predictable rhythm. Review the calendar, scan overnight emails, prepare for decisions that affected numbers more than people. Today, the routine felt suddenly inadequate, like putting on a suit that no longer fit the shape of his thoughts. He brewed coffee but barely tasted it. On the other side of the city, Annie was already awake, sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of the wall where her certificate hung. She traced the letters of her name with her finger, careful not to smudge the tape. "You're going to be late," her mother called gently from the bathroom. "I know," Annie replied. "I'm just looking." Karen emerged, fastening her earrings, her work uniform already on. She paused when she saw Annie on the floor. "You've been looking at that thing since yesterday," she said, smiling despite the fatigue in her eyes. Annie looked up. "Do you think he remembers me today?" Karen knew exactly who she meant. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "I think he does." Annie nodded, satisfied, as if that settled something important. At breakfast, Daniel finally checked his phone. Messages had multiplied: overnight advisors, board members, acquaintances he hadn't heard from in years. "You handled that beautifully. Very powerful moment. Great optics." He frowned. Optics. He closed the messages without replying and opened his calendar. The day was full, meetings stacked tightly, little room to breathe. He stared at the screen, then did something he hadn't done in a long time. He deleted one, then another. By mid-morning, Daniel found himself standing outside a modest office building on the edge of downtown. He didn't remember deciding to come here, only following a quiet internal pull that refused to be ignored. Inside, a hand-painted sign read, "Community Youth Services." He hesitated, then pushed the door open. The woman at the front desk looked up, surprised. "Can I help you?" "Yes," Daniel said. "I'm looking for someone who works with families, children." She studied him for a moment, then gestured toward a hallway. Second door on the left. The conversation was longer than he expected. Paperwork was discussed. Programs explained. Gaps identified. Daniel listened more than he spoke, something that came less naturally to him than most people assumed. "There are a lot of Annies," the coordinator said at one point, her voice weary but sincere. "Kids who show up alone because the adults in their lives can't afford to stop working." Daniel nodded. "What do they need most?" She didn't hesitate. Consistency. That word followed him out the door. Meanwhile, Annie's day at school felt different. Not easier, just different. A few classmates asked questions. Some were curious. One girl said her mom had cried watching a video online. Annie didn't quite understand that part. At recess, she sat on the swing, pumping her legs slowly. For once, she didn't feel invisible. She wasn't sure what she felt instead, only that it wasn't heavy. When the final bell rang, Karen was waiting at the gate. That alone made Annie's heart lift. "I got off early," her mother said, squeezing her hand. "I told my boss I needed it." Annie looked up, eyes wide. "Did you get in trouble?" Karen shook her head. "Not today." They walked home together, and Annie talked the entire way. That evening, Daniel stood in his apartment again, jacket draped over a chair, city lights blinking on one by one outside the window. He held his phone in his hand longer this time before dialing. Karen answered on the second ring. "Mr. Wright?" "Daniel," he said. "Please." There was a small pause. "Daniel," she repeated. "I wanted to check in," he said. "On Annie. On you." Karen exhaled softly. "She's good," she said. "Better than good. She feels seen." Daniel closed his eyes. "I'm glad." Another pause settled between them, heavier now, filled with things neither quite knew how to name. "I was wondering," Daniel said carefully, "if you'd be open to meeting for coffee sometime. No expectations. I don't want yesterday to be a moment that fades." Karen hesitated, then answered honestly, "I don't either." They set a time, a place. After the call ended, Daniel remained still, aware that he had crossed a line he couldn't uncross. Strangely, the thought didn't frighten him. In her bedroom, Annie lay on her stomach, drawing carefully with a dull blue crayon. The picture was simple. Two stick figures standing side by side under bright lights. She labeled them in careful, uneven letters. "Me," "to him." Then, after a moment's thought, she added a third figure nearby. "Mom." She smiled, tucked the drawing into her backpack, and turned off the light. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet certainty took root. This wasn't over. The cafe Daniel chose was small and unassuming. Tucked between a bookstore and a dry cleaner on a street most people passed without noticing. It wasn't the kind of place his colleagues frequented. There were no glass walls or polished marble, no sense of quiet prestige. Just worn wooden tables, the smell of coffee, and a chalkboard menu written by hand. He arrived early. That alone felt unfamiliar. Daniel sat near the window, hands folded around a ceramic mug that was slightly chipped at the rim. He hadn't checked his phone in 10 minutes, which for him was nearly a personal record. Every time the door opened, he looked up, then reminded himself to breathe. Across town, Karen adjusted Annie's collar for the third time. "You look fine," Annie said patiently. "You already fixed it." "I know," Karen replied, forcing a smile. "Just making sure. We have tonight for do that." Annie studied her mother's face with quiet seriousness. "You're nervous," she said. Karen laughed softly. "Am I that obvious?" "Yes," Annie said. "Your eyebrows do the thing." Karen shook her head. "I don't know why I'm so nervous. It's just coffee." Annie considered that. "You said it's important to say thank you properly." Karen nodded. "I did." "Then it's important," Annie concluded. They walked the few blocks to the cafe together. When Annie spotted Daniel through the window, she stopped short. "He's there," she whispered, as if saying it too loudly might make him disappear. Daniel saw her at the same moment. He stood immediately, almost knocking his chair over in the process. The movement was instinctive, unpolished. When Annie stepped inside, her eyes lit up. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he replied, his voice warmer than he expected. Karen followed, extending her hand. "Daniel," she said. "Thank you for meeting us." "I was not. Thank you for coming," he answered. They ordered drinks, coffee for the adults, hot chocolate for Annie, and took a table near the window. For a moment, no one spoke. It wasn't awkward exactly, just careful. Annie broke the silence. "This place smells like cinnamon," she announced. Daniel smiled. "That's a good thing, right?" She nodded. "It smells safe." Something in the way she said it made Karen look away briefly. As they talked, the edges softened. Annie chatted about school, about the swing set at recess, about how her teacher had asked her to explain what perseverance meant. Daniel listened, really listened, the way people rarely did with children. "You know," Annie said, sipping her hot chocolate. "My mom works in buildings like the ones you build." Daniel looked at Karen. "Really?" Karen nodded. "Night shifts sometimes. Offices, law firms, banks." Daniel absorbed that quietly. "I clean up after the day is done," Karen continued. "I see the empty desks, the leftover coffee cups. Sometimes I wonder if the people who sit there ever think about who comes after." Daniel met her eyes. "I think about it now." Karen didn't respond right away. She studied him, not skeptically, but carefully, as if deciding whether something fragile could be trusted with weight. After a while, Annie slid off her chair. "I'm going to look at the books," she said, pointing to a small shelf near the counter. "Stay where we can see you," Karen said automatically. "I will." As Annie wandered off, Daniel spoke more quietly. "I've been thinking about what you said on the phone," he told Karen. "About hating not being there." Karen nodded. "I miss things," she said simply. "Important things. And I tell myself it's temporary, but sometimes it doesn't feel that way." Daniel leaned back slightly. "I grew up missing things too," he said. Karen studied him again. "Why did you really do it?" she asked gently. "Stand with her." Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked toward Annie, now kneeling by the bookshelf, absorbed in the spines. "Because I know what it does to a child," he said finally, "to stand alone when everyone else has someone." Karen's voice softened. "And because you're kind." Daniel shook his head. "Because I was late to being brave." Karen smiled faintly. Annie returned a few minutes later with a book clutched to her chest. "Can we get this?" she asked. Karen glanced at the price tag and hesitated. Daniel noticed. "I've got it," he said easily. Annie looked between them. "Is that okay?" Karen nodded. "Yes." "Say thank you." "Thank you," Annie said solemnly. When it was time to leave, they stood outside the cafe for a moment, the afternoon sun slanting low between buildings. "Will we see you again?" Annie asked, direct as ever. Daniel met her gaze. "If you'd like." She nodded. "I'd like that. We have Diem step today." Karen hesitated, then extended her hand again. "We'd like that too." As they walked away, Annie turned and waved, her smile wide and unguarded. Daniel stood there for a long moment after they disappeared down the street. Something had shifted again, not dramatically, not loudly, but permanently. Time began to change shape after that, not dramatically, not in ways that could be measured on a calendar or summarized in a headline. It changed quietly, in the space between routines, in the pauses where something new had room to settle. Daniel found himself rearranging his schedule without fully realizing he was doing it. Meetings still happened. Calls were still returned, but the rigid edges softened. He stopped filling every hour with intention and started leaving small openings, gaps where something unplanned might enter. On Wednesday afternoons, those gaps led him to Annie. At first, the visits were simple. He would stop by the park near Annie's apartment after work, still in his suit, jacket folded over his arm. Annie would spot him from the swings and wave so hard her whole body tilted with the effort. "You're late," she would say, not accusingly, just stating a fact. "I know," he would reply. "Traffic." She accepted that explanation every time. Karen usually arrived a little later, breathless, her work bag slung over one shoulder. She never apologized. Daniel noticed that. Instead, she thanked him for waiting, and Annie always corrected her. He wasn't waiting, Annie would say. He was already here. Those words stayed with Daniel longer than he expected. At school, things shifted too. Annie's teacher called Karen one evening, her tone careful. "Annie seems more confident lately," she said. "She raises her hand more. She speaks up when other kids interrupt." Karen smiled as she listened. "She's found her voice," she said quietly. Annie didn't talk much about the ceremony anymore. She didn't need to. The moment had done its work and moved on, leaving something steadier behind. Daniel noticed changes in himself as well. He began to recognize the city differently, not as a series of projects and investments, but as a collection of lives intersecting in ways that rarely showed up on blueprints. One afternoon, he accompanied Karen to the grocery store. He pushed the cart while Annie darted ahead, tossing items in with joyful authority. "We need eggs," she announced, "and bread, and apples. The green ones, not the soft kind." "Man." Karen watched them from the end of the aisle, something like disbelief crossing her face. "You don't have to do this," she said quietly to Daniel when Annie ran ahead again. "I know," he replied. "I want to." Karen studied him, then nodded. "Just be patient with her," she said. "She's used to adults leaving." Daniel met her gaze. "So am I," he said. The words surprised both of them. Later that night, alone in his apartment, Daniel stood by the window and looked out over the city. He thought about legacy, a word that had once meant buildings and endowments and carefully curated impact statements. Now it meant something else. It meant showing up. Again and again. Across town, Annie sat at the small kitchen table, coloring carefully while Karen prepared dinner. "Mom?" Annie asked suddenly. "Yes, baby? Do you think he'll get tired of us?" Karen's hand stilled over the cutting board. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "But I know this: you're worth staying for, no matter what." Annie nodded, absorbing that with the seriousness she applied to all important things. At school the following week, Annie was assigned a group project. When another child complained about being paired with her, Annie didn't shrink. "That's okay," she said calmly. "I work hard." Her teacher noticed. So did the other children. Daniel heard about it later that evening as Annie recounted the story with dramatic flair. "And then I told him," she said, standing tall in the middle of the living room. "You don't have to like me, but you can't ignore me." Daniel laughed, genuinely this time. "Did you really say that?" Annie nodded. "I practiced it." Karen smiled from the doorway, pride and worry intertwined. As weeks passed, Daniel began receiving invitations again. Galas, panels, events that wanted his presence as much as his name. He declined more than he accepted. When he did attend, he found himself distracted, thinking about spelling tests and park benches and the way Annie wrinkled her nose when she concentrated. One evening, as he tucked Annie into bed after Karen worked a late shift, Annie looked up at him seriously. "You didn't leave," she said. Daniel paused. "I'm still here." She nodded. "I like that." So did he. But beneath the calm, something else stirred. Not everyone approved. At a board meeting the following Monday, a colleague leaned over and spoke in a low voice. "You're being talked about," he said. "People are curious." Daniel didn't ask what that meant. He already knew. Curiosity had a way of turning sharp when it brushed against things it didn't understand. He left the meeting early that day and went straight to Annie's school, watching from across the street as children poured out the doors. When Annie spotted him, her face lit up instantly. "Daniel," she shouted, forgetting all rules about inside voices. He waved back, heart tightening with something that felt dangerously close to fear. Because now, it wasn't just about standing next to her anymore. It was about what came next. The first sign that something was changing didn't come from Daniel's world. It came from Annie's. On a Thursday afternoon, she climbed into the car after school more quietly than usual. She buckled her seatbelt with deliberate care, her small fingers working slowly, as if the task required more concentration than it should have. Daniel noticed immediately. "How was your day?" he asked, keeping his tone light. Annie shrugged. "Okay." That answer was never good. He waited, giving her space. The car rolled forward, the city moving past them in a familiar blur. After a moment, Annie spoke again. "A boy said something today." Daniel didn't interrupt. He said, "It's weird that you come pick me up sometimes," she continued, eyes fixed on the window. "He said, rich people don't do that unless they want something." Daniel's hands tightened slightly on the steering wheel. "What did you say?" he asked gently. "I didn't say anything," Annie admitted. "I just went inside." There it was. The first crack. Daniel pulled over to the curb instead of driving on. He turned off the engine and looked at her fully. "Annie," he said, carefully, "do you think I want something from you?" She shook her head quickly. "No. No. Do you think you did something wrong?" "No." "Then what do you think he wanted?" She thought about that. "Maybe to make me feel small," Daniel nodded. "Sometimes people do that when they don't understand kindness." Annie frowned. "Why?" "Because if kindness is real," he said, "then it means their excuses stop working." She absorbed this silently. That evening, Karen listened as Annie recounted the story, her jaw tightening slightly. "I can talk to the school," Karen said. Annie shook her head. "I don't want trouble." Daniel met Karen's eyes. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. One built not on romance or obligation, but on shared concern. "This won't be the last time," Daniel said quietly. "The more visible we become, the more questions there will be." Karen sighed. "I know." Later that night, Daniel returned to his apartment and found an email waiting for him. Subject: concern. It was from a colleague he'd once considered a friend. "You're blurring lines. People are asking questions. Be careful how this looks." Daniel stared at the screen for a long moment. How this looks. The phrase followed him into the next day, into meetings, into conversations that suddenly felt coded with subtext. He noticed the glances now, the pauses when Annie's name came up casually in conversation. At lunch, another board member leaned back in his chair and said lightly, "You've gone soft." Daniel smiled politely. "I've gone human." The man laughed, assuming it was a joke. It wasn't. Across town, Karen felt it too. A neighbor asked too many questions. A coworker made a sideways comment about connections. Even well-meaning people seemed eager to define what Daniel was to Annie, to Karen, to the situation. No one asked what Annie needed. One evening, after Annie had gone to bed, Karen sat at the kitchen table with a stack of bills spread out in front of her. Daniel sat across from her, silent. "I don't want this to hurt her," Karen said finally. "She's just starting to feel safe." Daniel nodded. "I know." Karen looked up. "And I don't want you to feel trapped. You didn't sign up for this." Daniel didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was steady. "I signed up the moment I stayed." Karen studied him, searching for doubt. She didn't find it. At school the following week, Annie was called into the counselor's office. The counselor smiled warmly, but Annie sensed the tension beneath it. "Some adults have questions," the woman said carefully. "About your situation." Annie folded her hands in her lap. "What situation?" The counselor hesitated. "About Daniel." Annie's voice was calm. "He stood with me when I needed someone." The counselor blinked. "Yes, but that's all," Annie said. The counselor said nothing more. That afternoon, Annie didn't wait to tell Daniel. She climbed into the car and spoke immediately. "They asked about you," she said. Daniel nodded. "I figured they might." "Are you in trouble?" she asked. "No," he said, "but some people don't like things they can't label." Annie thought about that. "I don't like peas," she said, "but I don't make a meeting about it." Daniel laughed despite himself. But later that night, the laughter faded. A reporter called, then another. Daniel declined politely, firmly. But the calls kept coming. Curiosity sharpening into something less innocent. Karen watched the news more closely now. Annie noticed. "Are they going to make you go away?" Annie asked one night, her voice barely above a whisper. Daniel knelt in front of her. "No one can make me stop caring," he said. "That part is mine." She nodded, reassured for now. but the world had noticed them, and once noticed, it rarely looked away. The article appeared on a Sunday morning. Daniel found it by accident, not because he was looking for it, but because someone forwarded it to him with a single line beneath the link. You might want to see this. The headline was careful, polished, deceptively neutral. A billionaire's public kindness raises private questions. Daniel read it once, then again. The writer never accused him directly. They didn't have to. The language did the work for them, phrases like unconventional involvement, blurred boundaries, concerned community members. Annie's name was not printed, but enough details were included that anyone who wanted to connect the dots could. He closed the browser. Across the city, Karen read it too. She was halfway through folding laundry when her phone buzzed repeatedly on the counter. Messages stacked up faster than she could read them. Some were supportive, others were intrusive. A few were openly suspicious. She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the one that came when survival instincts kicked in. Annie was in her room, humming softly as she colored. Karen watched her through the doorway, the rise and fall of her shoulders steady, unaware for the moment of the world sharpening its focus. When Annie finally came into the kitchen, she noticed immediately. "You look like when the rent's due," she said. Karen managed a smile. "I am just thinking." Annie climbed onto a chair. "About what?" Karen hesitated, then chose honesty, measured and careful. "About how sometimes when people see something good, they try to pull it apart to understand it," she said. "And sometimes they hurt people while they're doing that." Annie frowned. "Why don't they just ask?" Karen laughed softly. "That's a very good question." That afternoon, Daniel drove across town without calling ahead. When Karen opened the door and saw him, relief and worry crossed her face at the same time. "I saw it," she said. "So did I," he replied. They stood there for a moment, neither stepping aside, neither turning away. "Come in," Karen said finally. They sat at the small kitchen table. Annie watched from the hallway, sensing the gravity of the moment even if she didn't understand it yet. "I don't want this to hurt her," Karen said quietly. "I don't want her to feel like she did something wrong by trusting you." Daniel leaned forward. "She didn't." "I know," Karen said. "But the world doesn't always agree with what's true." Daniel nodded. "If you want me to step back," he said carefully, "say the word." Karen looked at him sharply. "Is that what you want?" "No," he answered immediately. "But this isn't just about what I want." They fell silent. Annie broke it. "Are you mad at each other?" she asked, standing in the doorway. Both adults turned toward her. "No," Karen said quickly. "No," Daniel echoed. Annie walked closer, her brow furrowed. "Then why does it feel heavy?" Daniel crouched down so they were at eye level. "Because sometimes adults have to make choices that don't have easy answers," he said. Annie considered that. "Is it about me?" Karen inhaled sharply. "Yes," Daniel said gently. "But not because you did anything wrong." Annie looked between them. "Are you going to stop coming?" The question landed with quiet force. Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked at Karen, then back at Annie. "I'm still here," he said, "and I want to keep being here. But some people are asking questions that make things complicated." Annie's shoulders tensed. "Like the boy at school?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Like that." She thought for a long moment. "Did you know," she said slowly, "that when I was little, my mom used to tell me to stay quiet, so no one would notice us." Karen closed her eyes briefly. "I learned how to be small," Annie continued. "But when you stood with me, I didn't feel small anymore." Daniel felt something break open in his chest. "I don't want to be small again," Annie said. Neither adult spoke. That night, Daniel lay awake in his apartment, the city glowing indifferently beyond the windows. His phone buzzed with another message from a colleague. "This could damage everything you've built." He stared at the ceiling. Everything he'd built suddenly felt very small compared to what he stood to lose. The next morning, Karen was called into her supervisor's office. "We've had some inquiries," the woman said, her tone professional but distant. "About your personal associations." Karen straightened. "I do my job. No one is saying you don't," her supervisor replied. "But discretion matters." By the time Karen left work that day, her hands were shaking. That evening, Daniel received a call from his legal advisor. "You need to be careful," the man said. Visibility creates risk, especially when children are involved. Daniel closed his eyes. She's not a risk, he said. She's a child. I know, the advisor replied. But not everyone will see it that way. Daniel ended the call and sat in silence. Across town, Annie lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. Mom, she called softly. Yes, baby? If people say mean things, Annie asked. Does that mean we did something bad? Karen swallowed. No, she said firmly. It means they're afraid of what they don't understand. Annie nodded slowly. Then we're still okay. Karen kissed her forehead. We are, but as the lights went out in apartments and offices across the city, one truth remained undeniable. Standing with Annie had been easy. Standing for her would not be. The hearing room smelled faintly of old paper and disinfectant. Annie noticed it right away. She sat between her mother and Daniel on a narrow wooden bench, her feet not quite reaching the floor. She swung them gently, a habit she returned to when she was nervous, though she wouldn't have called it that. Nervous sounded too dramatic. This felt quieter, like waiting for a storm you couldn't see yet. Karen held Annie's hand tightly. Too tightly. Annie squeezed back, a small reminder that she was there. Across the room, 3 adults sat at a long table, 2 women and a man, all with folders open, pens resting on notepads. Their faces were calm, professional, unreadable. A seal on the wall behind them declared authority without explanation. Daniel sat straight, hands folded loosely, his expression composed. Years of boardrooms and negotiations had taught him how to appear unshaken even when the ground beneath him moved. But inside, something raw pressed against his ribs. This was different. A woman at the table cleared her throat. Thank you for coming, she said. This is an informal review, not a trial. We're here to understand the situation and ensure the child's well-being. Annie didn't like the word situation. Karen nodded. Of course, the woman glanced down at her notes. Mr. Wright, your involvement with Annie has drawn public attention. Some concerns have been raised. Daniel inclined his head slightly. I understand. Can you explain the nature of your relationship with the child? Daniel didn't look at Annie when he answered. He kept his eyes on the woman asking the question, his voice steady. I am a trusted adult in her life, he said. Nothing more, nothing less. The man at the table interjected. You are not a relative. No. Not a legal guardian. No. Yet you appear frequently with her. School pickups, public outings. Yes. Karen's fingers tightened around Annie's hand. Why? The man asked. The room seemed to hold its breath. Daniel paused, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wanted to choose it carefully. Because she asked me not to leave, he said. And because no child should have to learn that asking for support is dangerous. The woman's pen stopped moving. Annie felt her chest warm. She didn't fully understand what was happening, but she understood that Daniel was telling the truth. Another woman leaned forward. Miss Johnson, she said to Karen, do you feel pressured in any way by Mr. Wright's involvement? Karen straightened. Her voice was calm, but it carried something unyielding beneath it. No, she said. I feel supported. And more importantly, my daughter feels safe. Safe how? Karen didn't hesitate. Seen. Heard. Valued. There was a brief silence. Then the woman turned to Annie. And you, she said gently, softening her tone. Would you like to tell us how you feel? Annie's heart began to beat faster. She looked at her mom. Then at Daniel. He didn't nod. He didn't prompt. He simply stayed still. Annie took a breath. I feel like I'm allowed to be here, she said. The 3 adults exchanged quick glances. What do you mean by that? The woman asked. Annie thought for a moment. Before, I felt like I had to be quiet so no one would notice me. But when Daniel stood with me, I felt like I could take up space. Like I wasn't doing something wrong just by needing someone. Karen felt tears prick her eyes. The man cleared his throat. Do you understand why people might be concerned? Annie nodded slowly. Yes. Can you explain it? They think he might go away, Annie said. Or that he might not be who he says he is. And what do you think? The woman asked. Annie looked directly at Daniel now, then back at the panel. I think people are afraid of things that don't fit into boxes. she said carefully. But that doesn't mean they're bad. The room was very quiet. Daniel felt something shift, not in his favor necessarily, but in the room's understanding. That was more fragile, more important. The woman closed her folder. "Thank you, Annie," she said softly. That was very clear. After a few more procedural questions, they were asked to wait outside. In the hallway, Karen finally let go of Annie's hand and pulled her into a hug. "You did so well," she whispered. Annie hugged back. "I just told the truth." Daniel stood a few feet away, giving them space, his jaw tight. He stared at the wall, counting breaths, something he hadn't done since his 20s. After what felt like an hour but was probably 10 minutes, the door opened. The same woman stepped out. "We're not taking any action at this time," she said. "We'll continue to monitor the situation, but there's no evidence of wrongdoing." Karen sagged slightly with relief. "However," the woman continued, looking directly at Daniel, "visibility comes with responsibility. Be mindful." Daniel nodded. "I am." Outside, the late afternoon sun felt brighter than it had any right to. They stood on the courthouse steps, the city moving around them as if nothing had happened. Annie squinted up at the sky. "So, we're okay?" Karen knelt in front of her. "Yes, baby, we are." Annie turned to Daniel. "You didn't leave," she said again, as if confirming a fact she needed to keep alive. "I'm still here," he replied. As they walked away, Daniel felt the weight of what lay ahead settle more fully on his shoulders. This was no longer about rumors. It was about resolve. The days after the hearing were quieter on the surface, but heavier underneath. Nothing dramatic happened. No officials knocked on doors. No letters arrived stamped with authority. Life resumed its ordinary rhythms, which somehow made everything feel more fragile, as if the calm were conditional. Daniel became more careful, not distant, just deliberate. He stopped picking Annie up directly from school, choosing instead to meet them at the park or walk with them after Karen finished work. He didn't want Annie to feel hidden, but he understood now how easily attention could twist intention. Annie noticed the change. "You come later now," she observed one afternoon as they sat on a bench, watching pigeons gather near a discarded pretzel. "Yes," Daniel said. "Does that bother you?" She thought about it. "A little," she admitted. "But you still come." "Yes," he said again. "I still come." That answer seemed to satisfy her. Karen, however, felt the weight differently. At work, conversations became shorter, more guarded. Her supervisor watched her more closely, as if waiting for something to go wrong. Karen did her job with the same care she always had, but now every small mistake felt like it might cost more than it used to. One evening, as she and Daniel washed dishes together while Annie did homework at the table, Karen finally spoke the thought she'd been carrying. "I'm scared," she said quietly. Daniel didn't respond right away. He handed her a towel, then waited. "Not of you," she added quickly. "Of the system. Of how fast people decide who gets to belong and who doesn't." Daniel nodded slowly. "I know." Karen looked at him. "You could walk away from this?" she said. "No one would blame you. They'd say it was a misunderstanding, a moment that got too big." Daniel turned to face her fully. "And Annie?" he asked. Karen's voice wavered. She'd blame herself. "No," Daniel said firmly. "She wouldn't. She'd learn something much worse." Karen didn't ask what that was. She already knew. Later that night, Annie lay awake in bed, listening to the sounds of the apartment, the hum of the refrigerator, the distant traffic, her mother's quiet footsteps. She rolled onto her side and stared at the wall where her certificate still hung. She thought about the hearing room, about the way the adults had listened when she spoke, about how strange it felt to be taken seriously. She sat up and padded quietly into the living room. Daniel was there, sitting on the couch, reading but not really reading. "You're still here," Annie said. He smiled softly. "Yes." She climbed up beside him, curling her legs under herself. "I was thinking," she said. "That can be dangerous," he replied lightly. She smiled, then grew serious again. "If you ever can't come anymore," she said, "will you tell me first?" Daniel's chest tightened. "Yes," he said. "I promise. Not like disappearing," she added. "I don't like disappearing." "I won't disappear," he said. She studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found there, it seemed to ease her. Okay, she said, and leaned her head against his arm. The following week, Daniel received an invitation he couldn't ignore. A closed-door meeting. No press, no speeches. Just a small group of donors and board members concerned about reputation management. He arrived prepared, suit immaculate, expression neutral. The questions came quickly. You've become a liability. You're attracting the wrong kind of attention. Children complicate optics. Daniel listened. When it was his turn to speak, he didn't raise his voice. You're right, he said. Children complicate things. They make it harder to lie about what matters. Silence followed. One man leaned forward. Are you willing to risk everything you've built? Daniel thought of Annie on the stage, of her voice, steady and clear. Yes, he said. Because if what I've built can't survive doing the right thing quietly, then it deserves to fall. He left the meeting without waiting for a response. That afternoon, Karen received a call from Annie's school. Not a complaint, an invitation. They wanted Annie to speak at a small assembly about perseverance. Nothing public, just students and teachers. Karen hesitated, fear rising instinctively. I'll think about it, she said. When she told Daniel later, he watched Annie's face light up at the idea, then quickly shadow with doubt. Do I have to? Annie asked. No, Karen said. Only if you want to. Annie looked at Daniel. Will you stand with me? Daniel didn't answer immediately. He looked at Karen, silently asking permission. Karen nodded once. Yes, Daniel said to Annie. If you ask me, I'll stand with you. Annie smiled, small but radiant. That night, as Karen tucked Annie into bed, Annie asked, Do you think people ever stop being scared? Karen considered this carefully. I think they stop letting fear decide for them, she said. Annie nodded sleepily. I think you're doing that, she murmured. Karen kissed her forehead, tears burning behind her eyes. In his apartment later that night, Daniel sat alone, phone face down on the table. He thought about risk, about loss, about the quiet courage it took to stay when leaving would be easier. He thought about how the world watched loudly, but changed slowly, and he knew something with calm certainty. The hardest part wasn't standing with Annie when everyone could see. It was continuing to stand with her when no one was watching. The school assembly took place on a rainy Tuesday morning, the kind of rain that softened the edges of the world, blurring sidewalks and turning windows into mirrors. Annie pressed her forehead lightly against the glass as Karen drove, watching drops race each other downward. Do you think anyone will listen? Annie asked. Karen glanced at her in the rearview mirror. I think they will, she said. But more importantly, I think you will say what you need to say. Annie nodded, clutching the folded paper in her lap. She hadn't written much, just a few lines. Daniel had seen it the night before and hadn't offered to edit a single word. Your voice doesn't need fixing, he'd said. Now, as they pulled into the school parking lot, Annie's stomach fluttered again, not fear exactly, but awareness. This mattered. Daniel was already there, standing under the overhang near the entrance, rain dotting the shoulders of his coat. When he saw them, he straightened instinctively, the same way he always did when Annie entered a room. You came early, Annie said as she climbed out of the car. I didn't want to be late, he replied. Inside, the gym smelled like polished floors and damp jackets. Rows of folding chairs filled quickly, students shuffling into place, teachers standing along the walls with watchful expressions. This wasn't a ceremony, no flowers, no applause rehearsed in advance. That made it harder. Annie sat in the front row, her feet swinging again, the folded paper growing warm in her hands. Daniel sat beside her, close but not touching, present without crowding. When her name was called, the sound seemed louder than it should have been. Annie stood. She took one step, then paused. Daniel didn't say anything. He didn't need to. She looked at him. Stand with me, she whispered, not as a question this time, but a quiet truth they both understood. He stood. They walked to the front together. The microphone was lowered. Annie unfolded her paper with careful fingers. Her voice trembled on the first word, then steadied. My name is Annie, she said. I'm 6 years old. A few students smiled. A few whispered. She went on. Sometimes people think being strong means not needing anyone, Annie said. But I learned that being strong can also mean asking someone to stay. The room grew very quiet. When my mom couldn't be there, Annie continued, I felt invisible, like I didn't belong in the room. But someone stood next to me, and when he did, I felt like I could breathe again. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest, sharper this time. Annie looked out at the rows of faces. Even grown-ups, especially grown-ups. I think if we stood next to each other more, things would be different. She folded the paper again. That's all, she said. There was no immediate applause. Then, slowly, one teacher began to clap. Another followed. Then the students. The sound filled the gym, not loud, not wild, but sincere. Annie exhaled. When they sat back down, her hands were shaking. You did it, Daniel said quietly. She nodded. I didn't disappear. No, he said. You didn't. The days that followed carried a new weight. The assembly didn't make headlines. There were no articles this time. But something shifted inside the school. Annie noticed it first in small ways, a classmate saving her a seat, a teacher kneeling to listen instead of correcting her mid-sentence. Karen noticed it too. She's walking differently, Karen told Daniel one evening as they stood in the kitchen. Like she expects to be seen now. Daniel nodded. That's hard to take away once it settles. Not impossible, he added silently. Just harder. At work, Daniel felt the consequences more clearly. A major donor withdrew quietly. A partnership stalled without explanation. In meetings, his name was still respected, but less warmly. One afternoon, his assistant hesitated before speaking. You should know, she said carefully. Some people think you're distracted. Daniel smiled faintly. They're right. That night, Karen received an email from her employer. Budget restructuring. Reduced hours. She read it twice, her hands cold. When she told Daniel, he listened without interrupting. I don't want you to fix it, Karen said quickly. I just want you to know. I know, he replied. And I won't fix it without asking. Karen studied him, then nodded. Annie overheard enough to understand something was wrong. Is this because of me? She asked later, standing in the doorway. No, Karen said immediately. Daniel knelt in front of her. This is because sometimes doing the right thing costs something, he said. But that doesn't mean it wasn't worth it. Annie considered this seriously. Like when my mom gives me the last pancake. Karen laughed through tears. That weekend, Daniel made a decision. Not impulsive, not dramatic. He called a meeting with his legal team, then another with a foundation director he trusted. I want to formalize my involvement, he said. Transparency, boundaries, structure. They warned him. About precedent, about scrutiny. I know, Daniel said. That's why I'm doing it. When he told Karen, she sat very still. You don't have to do this, she said. I know, he replied. But I want to do it right. Annie listened quietly from the couch, legs tucked beneath her. What does formal mean? She asked. It means grown-ups write things down, Daniel said gently, so no one can pretend they don't understand. Annie nodded. That sounds smart. The paperwork would take time. Reviews, approvals. Nothing changed overnight, but something had already changed. Late one evening, Annie sat beside Daniel on the couch, leaning lightly against his arm. You know, she said sleepily, even if you weren't rich, I'd still want you to stand with me. Daniel smiled, eyes burning. That's good, he said. Because that's not the part that matters. She yawned. I think the world is loud, she murmured. But some people are quiet in good ways. Daniel looked down at her, the child who had asked a simple question and rearranged his life. Yes, he said softly. Some people are, and as Annie drifted toward sleep, Daniel understood with clarity that surprised him. This was no longer about helping. It was about commitment. The paperwork began quietly. No announcements, no celebratory language. Just forms, signatures, careful phrasing that turned intention into record. Daniel insisted on clarity not because he distrusted Karen, but because he had learned how easily good intentions could be questioned when left informal. Karen watched him read every page twice. You don't have to be this careful, she said one evening as Annie colored at the table between them. Yes, I do, Daniel replied. Care is how we protect what matters. Annie looked up. Are you protecting me? Daniel smiled. I'm protecting all of us. The process moved slowly, as these things always did. Background checks, home visits, conversations with people who asked the same questions in different ways, as if repetition itself could uncover dishonesty. Daniel answered calmly every time. Karen answered honestly. Annie answered simply. What do you want? One social worker asked her gently. Annie thought for a moment. To stay where people don't leave without saying goodbye, she said. That answer was written down. At school, the attention faded into something steadier. Annie was no longer the child with the story, she was just Annie again. The girl who liked puzzles, the girl who raised her hand even when she wasn't sure, the girl who sometimes stood too close when she talked, because closeness felt safer now. Karen noticed she laughed more easily. Daniel noticed she slept better. The outside world, however, was not finished watching. A columnist published a piece careful with language, polite in tone, but sharp underneath. Questions about boundaries, about influence, about optics. Daniel read it without comment. Karen found it later and grew quiet. They're not saying you did anything wrong, she said. No, Daniel replied. They're saying I shouldn't be here at all. Karen swallowed. I'm sorry. Daniel looked at her. Don't apologize for existing, he said. That's the lie people want you to believe. The following week, Daniel was invited to speak at a private event, an old circle, familiar faces. He considered declining, then changed his mind. He spoke about responsibility, about power used quietly, about how charity should never require gratitude in exchange for dignity. Some applauded, some did not. Afterward, a man he'd known for years pulled him aside. You've changed, the man said. Daniel nodded. I hope so. You're risking your legacy. Daniel thought of Annie's careful handwriting, of her small voice filling a gym. My legacy, he said, was always incomplete. That night, Annie asked a question that surprised them both. Do people not like you now? She asked as Karen braided her hair. Karen paused. Daniel answered before she could. Some people are uncomfortable, he said. Because of me? Annie asked quietly. Daniel knelt beside her. Because you remind them of something they forgot, he said. That children are not problems to be solved. They are people to be protected. Annie considered this. I don't feel like a problem, she said. Daniel smiled. Good. Never start. The next development came from an unexpected place. Karen was called into her supervisor's office. Not for reprimand, for an offer, a different position. Slightly less visible, slightly more secure. Karen understood immediately. Safety, disguised as opportunity. She went home with the weight of it pressing on her chest. I don't know what to do, she admitted that night. Daniel listened, hands folded, saying nothing. I'm tired of choosing between stability and dignity, Karen continued. I want Annie to be safe, but I don't want her to learn that silence is the price of survival. Daniel spoke carefully. Whatever you choose, he said, she'll learn something. The question is what you want that lesson to be. Karen didn't sleep much that night. In the morning, she declined the offer. The tension didn't explode. It didn't need to. Small consequences followed. Slower advancement, cooler conversations. Karen bore them quietly. One afternoon, Annie came home upset. They said you weren't really my family, she said, shoes still on, voice tight. Karen froze. Daniel knelt again, steady as ever. Who said that? A kid. His brother heard it from his dad. Karen's anger flared. What did you say? Annie shrugged. I said family is who stays when it's inconvenient. Daniel closed his eyes for a brief moment. That was very wise, he said. It didn't make him stop, Annie added. No, Daniel said. Truth doesn't always stop people, but it changes us. That evening, Daniel made another choice. He asked Karen if he could attend the next parent meeting at school. Not as a donor, he said. Not as anything special, just present. Karen hesitated, then nodded. At the meeting, he sat quietly in a folding chair. Listened, took notes, asked one question about funding for after-school programs. Someone recognized him. Whispers followed. Daniel stayed anyway. Afterward, A woman approached him. "My daughter was afraid to speak up until Annie did," she said. "Thank you." Daniel nodded. "Thank Annie." As weeks turned into months, the story lost its urgency for the world but not its meaning. The reviews came back clean. The reports were favorable. No one declared victory. They didn't need to. One night, as Annie colored at the table again, she looked up suddenly. "Are you tired?" she asked Daniel. He smiled. "Sometimes. Me too," she said. "But I like this tired." Daniel understood exactly what she meant. It was the tiredness that comes from choosing presence over ease, from standing when sitting would be simpler, from staying. The letter arrived on a Thursday, plain envelope. No return address that meant anything to Annie. Karen recognized it immediately, though her hands didn't shake when she opened it. She had learned not to give fear that satisfaction. It was formal, careful, courteous, a review update. Another step completed. Another step still pending. Karen read it twice, then folded it neatly and set it on the counter. "Good news?" Annie asked from the table, where she was lining up crayons by color. "Not bad news," Karen replied. Annie accepted that distinction easily. She had learned that in adult language, not bad news was sometimes the best kind. Daniel came by later that evening. He noticed the letter on the counter but didn't ask right away. He had learned patience from Annie, how waiting could be a form of respect. After dinner, when Annie was brushing her teeth, Karen finally spoke. "They want another interview," she said. "Separate, me and Annie." Daniel nodded slowly. "That's standard." "I know," Karen said. "I just hate that she keeps having to explain her life to people who already decided what they're looking for." Daniel leaned back in his chair. "She's explaining it on her terms," he said. "That matters." Karen smiled faintly. "You always find the steadier angle." "It's a learned skill," he replied. From a 6-year-old. The interview with Annie took place the following week in a small office that smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. The woman who greeted her knelt down to Annie's eye level, spoke gently, smiled often. Annie answered politely, clearly. "What do you like most about your home?" the woman asked. Annie thought. "That people listen," she said. "What do you like least?" Annie frowned slightly. "That people worry too much." The woman smiled, then glanced at her notes. "Do you feel safe?" Annie nodded. "Yes. Do you feel loved?" Annie hesitated, not uncertainty, but consideration. "Yes," she said finally, in a quiet way, not loud, but real. That answer was written down too. Karen's interview was harder, not because of trick questions, but because of implication. What if? Why then? How could you be sure? Karen answered without apology. "I work hard," she said. "I show up. I don't pretend things are easier than they are. I teach my daughter to speak honestly and stand with people who stand with her." The interviewer nodded, expression neutral but attentive. "And Mr. Hale?" she asked. Karen met her gaze. "He didn't rescue us," she said. "He joined us." The woman paused, then wrote something slowly. Daniel's interview came last. He wore no suit, just a clean jacket. Simple, unremarkable. He didn't posture, didn't defend. "I'm not replacing anyone," he said calmly. "I'm not claiming ownership over something that isn't mine. I'm committing to consistency." "And if this becomes inconvenient?" the interviewer asked. Daniel didn't hesitate. "Then it will still be right." After the interviews, time stretched again. Annie filled it with ordinary things, school projects, scraped knees, questions that came out of nowhere. "Do you think people are born brave?" she asked one night as Daniel helped her with a puzzle. "No," he said. "I think bravery is something you practice." She placed a piece carefully. "I think I'm practicing," she said. "You are," he agreed. One afternoon, Karen came home early. Annie noticed immediately. "Did you get fired?" she asked bluntly. Karen laughed despite herself. "No, I just took the afternoon off." Annie studied her. "You never do that." Karen shrugged. "I'm learning." They walked to the park together, Daniel joining them later. The air was cool, the light already turning golden. Annie ran ahead, then stopped suddenly. "Watch this," she called. She climbed halfway up the jungle gym, hesitated, then climbed back down. "I wasn't ready," she announced cheerfully. Daniel smiled. That's allowed. Karen watched him. You know, she said quietly, some people still think you're temporary. Daniel nodded. I know. That doesn't scare you? It used to, he admitted. Now it just reminds me to be present. That night, Annie asked to sleep with the door open. Just a little, she said. Daniel understood. He sat on the couch long after the apartment had gone quiet, thinking about permanence, about how fragile it was, about how easily it was mistaken for ownership. He didn't want to own Annie's future. He wanted to walk with her through it. The call came the next morning. Karen answered, heart steady. Approval. Conditional, but clear. Support structures acknowledged. Stability recognized. A recommendation to proceed. Karen closed her eyes as she listened, relief washing through her in slow waves. When she hung up, Annie was already watching her. Is it good news? She asked. Karen knelt and hugged her tightly. Yes, she said. It is. Annie hugged back, then pulled away to look at Daniel. Does this mean you stay? She asked. Daniel knelt too, meeting her at eye level. Yes, he said. It means I stay. Annie nodded, absorbing it carefully, as if making sure it fit. Okay, she said. Then I think we're doing this right. Daniel smiled, eyes bright. Later that evening, as they sat together eating takeout on the living room floor, Karen watched Annie talk animatedly, unburdened. She's lighter, Karen said softly. Daniel nodded. So are you. Karen looked at him. So are you. Daniel didn't deny it. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something to defend. It felt like something to grow into. The first morning after the approval felt strangely ordinary. Karen packed Annie's lunch the same way she always did: apple slices, a sandwich cut diagonally, a note folded small enough to feel like a secret. Annie tied her shoes slowly, humming to herself. Daniel stood by the door, coffee cooling in his hand, watching the ritual without interrupting it. Nothing had changed, and yet, everything had. At school drop-off, Annie hesitated before getting out of the car. You'll come later? She asked Daniel. Yes, he said, like always. She nodded, satisfied, and hopped down. Halfway to the door, she turned back and waved, not hurried, not anxious, just sure. Karen watched until Annie disappeared inside. I didn't realize how much energy it took to live in, maybe, she said quietly as they drove away. Daniel nodded. Certainty doesn't remove fear, he said. It just gives it less power. Karen exhaled. I like that. The following weeks tested that certainty not with threats, but with responsibility. Schedules needed adjusting. Appointments multiplied. Forms followed forms, each one a reminder that stability required maintenance. Daniel insisted on being present, not just involved. He attended school conferences, sat in waiting rooms, learned the names of Annie's classmates, her teacher's coffee order, the janitor who whistled in the hallways. He learned Annie's moods too, the quiet when she was processing something, the sudden talkativeness when she felt safe enough to spill every thought at once. One evening, as they walked home from the grocery store, Annie tugged on his sleeve. Do you know what I like best now? She asked. What? Daniel said. That I don't have to check if you're still there. Daniel stopped walking. Annie looked up at him, suddenly concerned. That's good, she added quickly. Right? Daniel crouched to her height. That's very good, he said. That means trust is growing. She nodded solemnly, as if this were a science experiment. Karen noticed changes in herself, too. She slept deeper, laughed faster, spoke more directly at work, no longer cushioning every sentence to avoid offense. Her supervisor noticed. You seem steadier, he remarked one afternoon. Karen smiled politely. I am. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. No praise, no reprimand. That was enough. The first conflict came unexpectedly. A parent approached Karen after school pickup, smiling, pleasant, careful. I just wanted to ask, the woman said. Is Annie confused? Karen felt the old instinct rise to explain, to soften, to make things comfortable. She didn't. No, Karen said. She's clear. The woman blinked. Oh, I didn't mean. I know, Karen replied. But clarity doesn't need defense. She walked away before the woman could respond. That night, Karen told Daniel what had happened. He listened, then said, I'm proud of you. Karen shook her head. I'm tired of being polite about my child's existence. Daniel smiled. That's how change happens. Quietly, one conversation at a time, Annie overheard just enough to ask, "Did someone say something weird?" Karen hesitated. Daniel answered. Someone asked a question that wasn't theirs to ask. Annie thought about this. Did you answer anyway? Yes, Karen said. Good, Annie replied. Sometimes adults forget they're not the boss of everyone. Daniel laughed softly. You're not wrong. A few days later, Annie brought home an assignment titled, My Family. She sat at the table, pencil hovering, unusually quiet. What's wrong? Karen asked. Annie frowned. I don't know how to draw it. Karen's chest tightened. You can draw whatever feels true. Annie looked at Daniel. Can I draw you, even though you didn't start there? Daniel answered carefully. Families aren't about starting points, he said. They're about choosing to keep going. Annie nodded, then began to draw. 3 figures, uneven lines, a house that leaned slightly to the left. Above them, she wrote, Still here. Daniel stared at the picture longer than he meant to. Later that week, Daniel declined another invitation, a public one this time. A reporter wanted a follow-up, a reflection, a redemption arc. Daniel said no. He didn't want Annie to grow up inside a story other people told about her. He wanted her to live one. That night, he sat alone on the balcony, city lights stretching endlessly, and thought about how easily good intentions could become performances. He was done performing. Annie joined him a moment later, wrapped in a blanket. Mom said I could sit with you, she said. He nodded, shifting so she could lean against him. Do you think people ever stop watching? She asked. Some do, Daniel said. Some never learned how not to. Do we care? Daniel considered this. Only when it helps us be kinder, he said. Never when it makes us smaller. Annie smiled, satisfied. A month later, a small envelope arrived addressed to Annie. Inside was a note from the school counselor. Thank you for reminding us that strength looks different in every child. Annie read it carefully, then folded it. Can we keep this? She asked. Yes, Karen said. It's yours. Annie tucked it into the same drawer as her certificate. Daniel watched her do it, then realized something quietly profound. The milestones were no longer about survival. They were about becoming. That night, as Annie slept, Karen and Daniel sat at the table. Paperwork spread out but untouched. We're really doing this, Karen said softly. Yes, Daniel replied. Karen met his eyes. You know this won't always be easy. Daniel nodded. I'm not here because it's easy. Karen smiled, something like peace settling in her expression. For the first time, the future didn't feel like a question. It felt like a responsibility they were ready to carry. The first real test arrived without warning. It wasn't loud. It wasn't public. It didn't come wrapped in confrontation or accusation. It came as a choice. Daniel received the call on a Wednesday afternoon, just as Annie's school day was ending. He recognized the number immediately, an old associate, someone who never called unless the stakes were high. I need you, the man said without preamble. In person, tonight. Daniel looked through the window of his office at the city below. Then at the clock. I can't tonight, Daniel replied. There was a pause on the other end, a surprised one. This isn't social, the man said. It's serious. You walking away from this could cost people jobs. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. I didn't say I was walking away, he said. I said I can't tonight. Then when? Tomorrow morning, Daniel answered. Early. Another pause. Less patient this time. Daniel, the man said carefully. You're asking others to bend around your personal life. Daniel's voice remained calm. I'm asking others to respect that my life includes people now. When the call ended, Daniel didn't feel relief. He felt clarity. That evening, as promised, he arrived at Annie's school. She was waiting near the gate, backpack too big for her shoulders, hair slightly undone from the day. You're late, she observed. Yes, Daniel said. I'm sorry. She studied him, then nodded. That's okay. You came. They walked home slowly. Annie kicked a small stone along the sidewalk, deep in thought. Do grown-ups have to choose between important things? She asked. Daniel considered this carefully. Yes, he said, all the time. What if both things are important? That's when choices show who we are, he replied. Annie kicked the stone harder. I don't like that. Neither do I. Daniel admitted. At home, Karen noticed Daniel was quieter than usual. Long day? She asked. Long decision, he replied. Karen didn't press. She had learned when silence was an invitation, and when it was simply rest. Later, after Annie had gone to bed, Daniel told her about the call. They're testing you, Karen said. Yes, Daniel agreed. Not intentionally, just naturally. People always test new boundaries. And? Karen asked. And I'm not moving the boundary, he said. Karen watched him for a long moment. That's going to cost you. Daniel nodded. I know. Karen reached across the table, resting her hand lightly over his. Then you're doing it right. The consequences came quickly. The meeting the next morning was polite but cold. Daniel's input was minimized. Decisions were made without him. When it ended, the associate pulled him aside. You're different now, he said, not unkindly. Daniel nodded. I am. I hope you know what you're trading. Daniel met his gaze. I do. At school, Annie faced a different test. A teacher new, unfamiliar, asked her during group time to explain her family drawing from earlier in the year. Annie froze. The room felt suddenly too small. I don't want to, Annie said quietly. The teacher smiled, meaning well. It's okay. We're all friends here. Annie shook her head. It's not okay for me. The teacher hesitated, surprised. I'll draw something else, Annie added, her voice steady. The teacher nodded slowly. All right. That afternoon, Annie told Karen what had happened. I didn't cry, she said, a little proud. My stomach felt funny, but I didn't cry. Karen hugged her tightly. You set a boundary, she said. That's brave. Daniel listened quietly. Later that night, he asked Annie, how did you know it was okay to say no? Annie shrugged. Because you say no when it matters. Daniel felt something settle inside him then. This was the part no one talked about. Not the standing beside her when it was visible, but the quiet transfer of courage. The next weekend, Daniel declined another invitation. Then, another. Not everything, just the ones that demanded too much of the wrong kind of attention. His world grew smaller, but it grew truer. Karen noticed changes in him that surprised her. He laughed more easily, slept more deeply, listened more fully. You seem lighter, she told him one evening as they folded laundry together. I stopped pretending I could be everywhere, Daniel said. Turns out, I only needed to be here. Annie, overhearing, popped her head into the room. Here is a good place, she announced. Yes, Daniel said. It is. One afternoon, Annie brought home a permission slip. Field trip, museum, parents encouraged to attend. Annie stared at the paper. What if you can't come? She asked quietly. Daniel took the paper, reading it carefully. I'll make it work, he said. But what if? I'll tell you first, he said gently. Remember? Annie nodded, reassured. That night, Daniel adjusted his schedule, canceled a meeting, delegated another. Not because he had to, because he chose to. The museum trip was loud, chaotic, full of running children and echoing halls. Daniel stood beside Annie, listening as she explained exhibits with confidence that would have terrified her months earlier. Karen watched from a distance, heart full. A woman standing nearby leaned over. You're her father? She asked Daniel casually. Daniel paused. Karen held her breath. Yes, Daniel said simply. The word landed gently. No explanation, no correction, just truth. Annie smiled up at him. Later, as they drove home, Annie said, I like when you say it like that. Like what? Daniel asked. Like it's not a big deal, she replied. Daniel nodded. Because it shouldn't be. That night, as Annie slept, Daniel sat alone again, thinking about the man he had been before this all began. Efficient, respected, untethered. He didn't hate that man, but he didn't miss him either. He understood now that commitment wasn't something you announced. It was something you proved again and again through choices no one applauded. Through staying when leaving would cost less. Through being present when presence was inconvenient. This wasn't the climax. It was the foundation, and it was holding. The invitation arrived the way these things always did, quietly, wrapped in good intentions. A community recognition dinner, local leaders, educators, donors, a celebration of shared values. Daniel read the email twice before closing his laptop. Karen noticed immediately. "You don't like it," she said. "I don't trust it," Daniel replied. Annie, sitting on the floor nearby, building a tower out of mismatched blocks, looked up. "What's a recognition dinner?" Daniel smiled faintly. "It's when adults clap for each other." Annie considered this. "Do they need it?" Karen laughed softly. "Some of them think they do." The dinner wasn't mandatory. But it wasn't optional either, not if Daniel wanted to keep certain doors open. Doors that still mattered, even now. "I don't want Annie there," Karen said, after Daniel explained. "I wouldn't bring her," Daniel replied. "This isn't her space." Karen nodded. "That's what worries me." The night of the dinner, Daniel put on a suit he hadn't worn in months. It fit the same, but he didn't. He caught his reflection and barely recognized the man, looking back not because he'd changed physically, but because the role felt borrowed now. Before leaving, he checked on Annie. She was already in bed, hair fanned across the pillow, clutching the corner of her blanket. "Will you be late?" she asked sleepily. "Yes," Daniel said. She nodded, eyes half closed. "Will you come back?" Daniel's chest tightened. "Yes," he said without hesitation. She smiled, reassured, and drifted off. At the dinner, Daniel was greeted warmly, too warmly. Hands clasped his. Voices praised his generosity, his leadership, his influence. Someone made a joke about the little girl who stole his heart. Daniel smiled politely, but didn't laugh. When he took his seat, the speaker began with a story one Daniel had heard before. A version of events polished smooth, stripped of discomfort. It was a story where kindness had no cost, where power remained untouched, where children existed as symbols, not people. Daniel felt something shift. When it was his turn to speak, the room expected gratitude. He didn't give it. "I didn't come here to be recognized," Daniel said calmly. "I came because I was invited, and because I believe in being honest in rooms like this." A ripple moved through the audience. "I've learned recently," he continued, "that real responsibility isn't loud. It doesn't photograph well, and it doesn't always make people comfortable." Silence. "If our generosity depends on applause," Daniel said, "then it's not generosity, it's performance." Someone shifted uncomfortably. "I won't speak for anyone else," he added, "but I'm done performing." He stepped away from the podium before anyone could interrupt. The applause that followed was uneven, polite, conflicted. Daniel didn't stay to interpret it. When he arrived home, the apartment was quiet. Karen had left a light on in the kitchen. A note sat on the counter. She slept. Annie didn't. Daniel found her sitting up in bed, eyes open. "You're back," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied, sitting beside her. "You sound different," Annie observed. "How?" he asked gently. "Like when you don't pretend to like broccoli," she said. Daniel laughed softly. "That's accurate. Did you tell the truth?" she asked. "Yes, even if it made people squirm." "Yes," Annie nodded approvingly. "Good." The following days brought the expected fallout. Invitations stopped. Calls slowed. A project Daniel had supported was reassigned. He felt it, but not as loss, as sorting. Karen noticed too. "They're pulling away," she said one evening. "Yes," Daniel replied. "The ones who needed me to stay convenient." Karen studied him. "And how do you feel about that?" Daniel thought carefully, relieved. At school, Annie faced her own reckoning. A classmate repeated something overheard at home. "My dad says you're lucky," the girl said. "Some kids don't get picked." Annie frowned. "I didn't get picked," she replied. "I asked." The girl blinked, confused. Annie added, "That's different." That night, Annie told Daniel the story. "I don't think she understood," Annie said. "That's okay," Daniel replied. "Understanding takes time." Annie was quiet for a moment. "Do you ever wish you didn't say yes?" Daniel looked at her steadily. "No, not even when it's hard? Especially then," he said. Later that week, Daniel received a call from the foundation's legal team. "All requirements are met," the woman said. "Finalization is ready when you are." Daniel closed his eyes briefly. "When?" he asked. "Your timeline?" she replied. Daniel chose a date, not symbolic, not public, just soon enough to matter. He told Karen that evening. She sat down slowly. "This is real," she said. "Yes," Daniel replied. Karen covered her face for a moment, emotion breaking through at last. "Thank you," she whispered, not to him alone, but to the choice itself. When they told Annie, she listened carefully. "Does this mean you're stuck with me?" she asked. Daniel smiled. Happily, she nodded. "Okay, just checking." That night, Annie asked to draw something. She brought the picture to Daniel before bed. It showed 3 figures again, but this time, the house stood straight. Above it, she'd written, "Stayed." Daniel stared at it, throat tight. This was the moment people imagined when they talked about endings, but Daniel knew better. This wasn't the end. It was the moment where the story stopped being about survival and became about responsibility. Not chosen once, chosen every day. The morning of the finalization dawned quietly. No reporters waited outside. No speeches were prepared. The city moved as it always did, buses stopping. Coffee poured. Doors opening and closing, unaware that something permanent was about to be made official in a small courthouse room. Annie wore a simple blue dress. Not new, but carefully pressed. Karen braided her hair slowly, fingers steady, breath controlled. "Do I have to say anything?" Annie asked. "Only if you want to," Karen replied. Annie nodded. "I think I will." Daniel arrived early, as he always did now. He stood in the hallway, hands folded, not pacing. He felt calm not because the moment was small, but because it was honest. When they called Annie's name, she stood without hesitation. She walked between Karen and Daniel, her steps measured, confident in a way that would have been impossible a year ago. The judge looked down at her kindly. "Do you understand why you're here today?" "Annie?" Annie nodded. "Yes. And why is that?" "Because we chose each other," Annie said. The judge smiled, not indulgently, but with respect. "That's a good reason." The paperwork was reviewed, the language precise. Legal terms wrapped around something deeply human. Daniel signed first. Karen followed. Then Annie was handed a pen too big for her hand, but she held it carefully anyway. She signed her name slowly, deliberately. When it was done, the judge looked up. "This court recognizes," she said, "that family is not defined by convenience, appearance, or silence. It is defined by commitment." She paused, then added, "This arrangement is now permanent." Annie blinked. "Permanent?" she asked softly. "Yes," the judge replied. "It means it doesn't disappear." Annie smiled. That was all she needed. Outside, the air felt different, lighter somehow. Karen breathed in deeply, as if she'd been holding her breath for years without realizing it. Daniel stood beside her, not touching, giving space for the moment to settle. Annie broke the silence. "So," she said, looking up at them both. "What happens now?" Karen laughed, a sound full and unrestrained. "Now we go get lunch." Annie considered this. "Celebration lunch?" "Yes," Daniel said. "Celebration lunch." They chose a small diner. Nothing fancy. Booths worn smooth by decades of elbows and conversations. Annie ordered pancakes. Karen ordered coffee, and nothing else. Daniel ordered whatever Annie pointed to. As they waited, Annie slid out of the booth and stood between them. "I want to say something," she announced. Karen and Daniel both stilled. "I know I asked you to stand next to me," Annie said, looking at Daniel. "And you did. But you also stayed when it stopped being important to everyone else." Daniel swallowed hard. Annie turned to Karen. "And you didn't let them make you smaller just so I could be safer. You taught me that being scared doesn't mean being quiet." Karen reached for her hand, eyes shining. Annie climbed back into the booth, satisfied. "I think we're a good team," she concluded. "Yes," Daniel said softly. "We are." That evening, they returned home, not to a house that symbolized rescue or escape, but to a place shaped by routine and care. Annie put her drawing on the refrigerator, the last one she had made. 3 figures. No labels this time, just a doorway. Open. Karen watched her do it. "She's going to be okay," Karen said quietly. Daniel nodded. "She already is." Later, after Annie had gone to bed, Karen and Daniel sat at the table one last time with no papers between them. "It's strange," Karen said. "For so long, everything felt conditional." Daniel nodded. "Now it's accountable." Karen smiled faintly. "I like that better." Daniel looked at the clock, then back at Karen. "I know I'll never replace what Annie lost," he said. Karen met his gaze. "She didn't lose," she said. She waited. Daniel let that settle. In the hallway, Annie's door was open just a crack. Daniel stood there for a moment, watching her sleep. She was sprawled awkwardly, one arm thrown above her head, utterly unguarded. He thought of the man he used to be, measured, contained, untouched. He didn't resent that man, but he understood now how incomplete that life had been. This quiet, demanding, unglamorous responsibility was not a sacrifice. It was a return. Annie stirred slightly, murmuring something unintelligible. Daniel stepped back, closing the door just enough to leave the light spilling in. The world outside would keep arguing. People would keep judging. Systems would keep failing and repairing themselves imperfectly. But inside this home, something had been made certain. Not perfect, not easy, but chosen, and chosen again. Somewhere, long after the applause faded and the questions stopped being asked, the simplest truth remained. A little girl had been brave enough to ask, and a man had been brave enough to stay. Not for a moment, not for a story, but for a lifetime. The lesson this story offers is simple but profound. Real family is not created by blood, wealth, or public approval, but by the courage to stay when it would be easier to leave. In a world that often rewards convenience and appearances, the story reminds us that quiet loyalty, moral responsibility, and everyday presence are the true measures of character. It speaks especially to those who have lived long enough to know that justice is rarely loud, that love is proven through consistency, and that the smallest acts of standing beside someone can change a life, sometimes forever. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.